Story 1. So, just finished a long day of hiking and decided to set up camp for the night. It was around 9:30 p.m., pitch black, but still a few hours before sunrise. I got my tent up and started gathering firewood from the nearby trees. Plenty of dead ones in this area. After I had enough wood, I started building a small fire about 20 feet away from my tent. I didn't want a big fire, didn't want to attract any unwanted attention or disturb any of the local wildlife. As soon as the fire started burning, something caught my eye on top of a hill across from me. It looked like an animal standing upright with its back facing me. This thing was huge, at least 8 feet tall. It towered over everything else around it. The closest tree was only 5 feet tall. My first thought was bear, because bears can stand on their hind legs sometimes when they're eating or trying to get into trash cans. But after watching this thing for a few seconds, I realized it couldn't have been a bear. Its arms were way too long and skinny compared to its body size. Plus, bears don't usually walk on 2 legs unless they're scared or surprised. So, my next guess was Bigfoot. This thing stood there motionless for about 30 seconds until another one came walking towards it from behind. These creatures walked down the hill together, side by side, until they disappeared out of sight. After they left, I felt safe enough to go inside my tent and sleep without worrying about anything else happening during the night. The next morning when I woke up, everything seemed normal except for one strange detail. There were no footprints anywhere near where I had seen these things last night. No tracks leading down the hill either, which is weird considering how steep that slope is. I talked to my uncle who has lived in this area for over 30 years, and he told me that he's seen these creatures several times. He said they're very good at hiding their tracks. I haven't seen them again, but I know they're still out there somewhere. Story 2. Hey everyone, I wanted to share a story from my childhood that's always stuck with me. I was about 10 years old at the time, and my family and I had just moved to a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. It was a bit of a culture shock coming from a different state, but we were excited for the change of scenery. We were staying with my grandparents, who lived not too far from us. Their house was perched on top of a hill, surrounded by dense woods on all sides, except for the back, which opened up to a sprawling field. It was the kind of place where you could scream at the top of your lungs and not a soul would hear you. The nearest neighbors were miles away, hidden amongst the rolling hills and dense foliage. This was our first time staying with them for an extended period of time, a few weeks to be exact. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. The house was old and creaky, filled with strange noises that would keep me up at night. But during the day, it was a child's paradise. The woods were ripe for exploration, and the field was perfect for a game of catch. So, one night, my parents decided to turn in early, leaving my sister and I to our own devices. We were huddled up on the couch, engrossed in some late-night TV show, when we started hearing these weird noises outside. It sounded like twigs snapping, branches breaking, the usual sounds you'd expect to hear in a forest. We didn't think much of it at first, considering deer were a common sight around these parts. Heck, we've even had them come right up to the windows before. But then, things took a turn for the creepy. We heard footsteps. Not the light, skittish kind you'd expect from a deer, but heavy, deliberate ones. The kind that sends a chill down your spine. They were coming down the driveway, getting louder and closer with each passing second. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was making those sounds wanted us to know they were coming. They weren't trying to be stealthy or sneaky. They were announcing their presence. We froze, our eyes wide with fear, as the footsteps reached our porch. It was a terrifying realization. Whoever was out there knew exactly where we were. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the TV reflecting off our faces. The moonlight streaming in through the windows was the only other source of light, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. But then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. After taking a couple of steps onto the porch, they turned around and walked away. We sat there, frozen in fear, for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the footsteps to return, but they never did. Eventually, exhaustion took over and we fell asleep right there on the couch, facing each other across the coffee table. We never did find out who, or what, was walking around our house that night. The next morning, my sister woke me up with a look of terror on her face. She told me that she had seen someone standing outside her bedroom window last night. The figure was dressed in overalls and had his face covered by some kind of cloth mask or hoodie. She said he stood there, staring into her room, not moving for several minutes before turning around and leaving without making a sound. She couldn't see him leave because her blinds were closed, but she was sure he had walked all the way down from wherever he had come from. She thought it might have been that guy who lived nearby, the one everyone in town called Crazy Ralph. He was a bit of a local legend, known for his eccentric behavior and odd appearance. He wore overalls all the time, regardless of the weather or season, and always had dirt smeared across his face. His hair was greasy and stuck out in all directions, and he had a habit of talking incoherently when you tried to engage him in conversation. But despite his oddities, he somehow managed to make sense when he was part of a group conversation. He was known to wander aimlessly around town, muttering things no one could understand and staring blankly into space. He was like this all the time, every day of the year, and had been like this for as long as anyone could remember. He never changed, physically or mentally, and that's what made him so unsettling. We never found out if it was indeed Crazy Ralph who had been outside our house that night. But the incident left a lasting impression on us, and we were always a little more cautious after that. We made sure to lock our doors and windows every night, and we never stayed up late watching TV again. It was a chilling reminder that even in a small, quiet town like ours, strange and scary things can happen. Story 3. I was living with my wife on our farm near Waynesboro, Virginia. We'd been there for about half a year when this weird incident happened. It was late, around 10 p.m., and my wife was inside watching TV while I was outside working on some stuff. Our workshop was right next to our house. Out of the blue, my wife calls me over, saying something strange was happening. She pointed out these lights in the sky, moving in a way that was just off. They looked like stars, but they were moving way too fast to be planes or satellites. And they weren't just moving in a straight line, they were disappearing and reappearing somewhere else after a few seconds. There were about 4 of these lights, and they seemed to be circling each other while also moving randomly. After about 5 minutes of this, my wife decided to go inside and grab her camera. We'd never seen anything like this before and thought we should document it. But when she came back out, I told her to forget about the camera and just watch. The lights started moving closer together, forming a triangle shape. There were no visible edges between them, just this solid triangle of light. And then, out of nowhere, they shot off towards the horizon at an insane speed. They were out of sight in 2 seconds flat. So, it's late fall, early winter, around 11 p.m., and I'm jolted awake by my wife. She's got this panicked look on her face and she's saying, "There are people walking down our driveway." Now, we live in a pretty secluded area, so this is definitely not a common occurrence. I'm thinking maybe someone's lost or needs help, so I grab my flashlight and head outside to check it out. But when I get out there, there's no one in sight. Just as I'm about to head back inside, I look up and see these 2 bright white lights in the sky directly overhead. Now, I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but this is eerily similar to an encounter we had earlier in the year. These lights, they're not like any aircraft lights I've ever seen. They're not blinking, they're not moving, they're just there. But then they start to move. They drop straight down, disappearing behind some trees. Now, I'm not one to shy away from a mystery, so I decide to investigate. I walk towards the trees, flashlight in hand, ready for whatever I might find. But when I get there, there's nothing. Just more woods. No sign of any landing or any people. Now, I know this sounds crazy. I mean, I can hardly believe it myself. But I swear to you, this is 100% true. Now, a few weeks go by, and I'm driving home from work one evening around 9 p.m. It's not dark yet, and my headlights catch some movement up ahead by the side of the road. There's a small creek that runs under Route 250, just past the Waynesboro Airport. So, I'm familiar with the area. As my eyes adjust, I slam on the brakes, thinking I'm about to hit something. But what I see next is something I could never have prepared for. I find myself staring face to face with an 8-foot-tall alien creature. He's standing beside his UFO. He's wearing tight-fitting black clothing, similar to what a motorcycle rider might wear. But he's not wearing a helmet or goggles. Instead, he's got some kind of headgear device attached to him with wires. The wires run down his back and connect him to his ship, which is sitting silently behind him. His skin color is like a mix of chocolate milk and coffee beans. It's smooth and almost shiny, but not wet like you'd expect if it was exposed to the cold weather. He's standing upright, like a human, but he's taller and thinner than any man I've ever seen. I'm not sure what he was doing there, maybe just checking out the humans that pass by every day on this stretch of highway. But whatever it was, it's an experience I'll never forget. I've never seen anything like it before or since, and I doubt I ever will again. I just hope that if he's still out there, he's found what he was looking for. Story 4. So, I just got off work, right? It's about 10:30 p.m., and I'm in the Appalachian Mountains. I decide to take a stroll on this trail that wraps around my apartment complex. It's dark, but the streetlights are doing their job, so visibility isn't too much of an issue. The trail is about half a mile long, and it cuts through some dense woods, with thick brush on either side of the path. There's also a set of train tracks that run parallel to the trail, which adds an extra layer of creepiness to the whole scene, especially at night. You can hear the trains coming from miles away before they actually come into view. So, I'm walking along, minding my own business, when I start hearing footsteps behind me. They're about 50 yards back, but I don't think much of it. There are other people living in my complex who use this trail regularly, and we get hikers passing through at all hours. But as I keep walking, these footsteps start getting louder and more frequent. It's like whoever is behind me is picking up the pace, trying to catch up to me. And then, before I know it, they're right next to me. We're walking side by side. Here's the thing. At first, I thought it was just one person, but then I realized there were 2 or 3 people following me. Their footfalls sounded like an echo when they stepped down onto the pavement, almost like a group of teenagers trying to scare someone by mimicking each other's steps. But not quite right. I mean, it was weird, but I didn't think too much of it. I just kept walking, trying to ignore them. But then things started getting really weird. The footsteps stopped completely. No echoes anymore. Just dead silence. I mean, it was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I stopped walking and turned around, expecting to see a group of people standing there, but there was no one. Just trees and bushes. I was alone on the trail, and then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud whistle followed by a "hey!" It was so loud and sudden that I jumped back against a tree trunk. I turned towards where the voice came from, but there was no one there. Just more trees and bushes. But there were no sounds of anyone running away or anything else moving around. It was like the voice came out of thin air. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what just happened. But the more I thought about it, the the more confused I got. I mean, who were those people following me? And where did they go? And who was that voice? I have no idea. It's just too creepy. At this point, I'm freaking out. My heart is pounding in my chest, and I'm sweating bullets despite the cold. I'm starting to think I'm losing my mind, or someone is playing a sick joke on me. I mean, are they hiding somewhere nearby, waiting for their chance to jump out and scare me? Or worse, I'm not usually one to scare easily, but this was different. It felt like I was in some sort of horror movie, and I was the unsuspecting victim. I mean, I've heard stories about strange things happening in these woods, but I never thought I'd experience it firsthand. I decided to book it out of there, running as fast as I could back to my apartment. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, with the door locked behind me. I was shaking and out of breath, but at least I was safe. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud against the window. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to look, expecting to see a face pressed against the glass, but there was nothing. Just the dark night and the faint glow of the streetlights. I let out a sigh of relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every little noise. I kept the lights on and the curtains drawn, too scared to even peek outside. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. The next day, I went back to the trail, this time in broad daylight. I wanted to see if there were any signs of what happened the night before, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was like it never happened. I still don't know what happened that night. Was it all in my head? Was it some sort of prank? Or was it something else? I guess I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I'm never walking that trail alone at night again. So that's my story. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear it's true. Story 5. So, I'm driving home from work one night, right? It's around 11:30 p.m., and I'm taking this back road because of some construction on the main route. Now, this isn't a busy road even during the day, so at this hour, it's practically deserted. I'm not really worried about anything, just cruising along, listening to some tunes, and enjoying the solitude. The road is flanked by woods on either side, and it's a pretty long stretch, so there's nothing but trees and darkness for miles. Suddenly, my headlights catch something moving in the periphery. My first thought is, oh, it's probably a deer, or maybe even a bear. We get a lot of wildlife around these parts, so it wouldn't be unusual. But then, as soon as that thought crosses my mind, this thing stands up on two legs and bolts across the road right in front of my car. I slam on the brakes, heart pounding, as this creature disappears into the woods on the other side. Now, I'm not one for tall tales, but I swear to you, this thing looked like some sort of wolf-dog hybrid. It was big, and it moved with this unnatural speed and agility. But the most unsettling part? Its eyes. They were glowing red in the darkness, like two burning coals. I can't really describe it any better than that. It was like something out of a horror movie or a nightmare. I sat there for a good few minutes, just trying to process what I'd seen, before I finally managed to get my shaking hands back on the wheel and continue my drive home. It didn't seem to be hurt by the car hitting him or her, since he just kept running into the woods after crossing the road. My heart started racing when I realized what happened, and all sorts of thoughts went through my head at once. What if there are more? Did they see me? Are they going to attack me? All these questions raced through my mind until finally I decided to turn around and go back home instead of taking that same route again. When I got home, I locked all doors and windows before heading upstairs, where I sat awake for hours, waiting for something else to happen. I kept replaying the incident in my head, trying to make sense of it. I mean, what was that thing? Was it a wild animal? Or something else? I don't know. All I know is that I'm not taking that road again anytime soon. Story 6. Hey everyone. I've got a story to share that I think you'll find interesting. So, a few years back, I was in my early 20s and had just moved from sunny Florida to the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia with my then girlfriend. We were living in this old farmhouse that her folks owned. They lived about half an hour away in another town, but they'd swing by every so often to check on us or drop off supplies. The house was pretty isolated, perched on a mountain ridge and surrounded by dense forest on all sides, except for one side which had a view of the valley below. We didn't have any electricity or running water, so we used lanterns and candles for light and collected rainwater from the roof gutters for washing and cooking. It wasn't the most comfortable living situation, but it was better than paying rent somewhere else, especially since we were both broke at the time. Plus, we got to live rent-free, which was a bonus. There weren't any neighbors for miles around. There were a few other houses nearby, but they were far enough away that you couldn't see them unless you went outside during the day, which we rarely did. One day, I was out walking in the woods near our house, and I stumbled upon what looked like an abandoned shack. It was deep in the trees, in a part of the forest that was so overgrown with vines and brush that you'd get stuck if you tried to walk through it. The shack itself was straight out of a horror movie. It was falling apart, with holes in the walls big enough for me to stick my head through, windows that had been smashed out a long time ago, and floorboards that were so rotted they'd sink into nothingness if you stepped on them. It gave me the creeps just looking at it, but for some reason, I felt drawn to it. Maybe part of me wanted to prove that it wasn't haunted, or maybe I was just curious. Whatever the reason, I decided to go inside. The shack was completely empty, except for a single wooden chair in the middle of the room. It looked like someone had been living there at some point, because I could see old blankets and pillows strewn about on the floor. There were also several candles scattered around that had burned down to nothing but pools of wax. An old rusty knife was laying on one of the blankets with dried blood all over its blade. It didn't look like anyone had been here in a while, though. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs everywhere you looked. I couldn't help but wonder who had lived here and what had happened to them. Had they left? Or had they died here? I shuddered at this thought. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, something grabbed me from behind. Before I knew what was happening, my feet were off the ground and I was being carried outside into the daylight. My attacker dropped me onto the ground before running away back towards our house through the dense forest. They didn't say a word or make any noise whatsoever. It was almost inhuman. When I finally got up off my back, after having fallen face first onto the dirt, I saw my dog standing right next to me. He was holding a large stick with both hands raised above his head, ready to strike again if he needed to. I've had this dog since I was a kid. He saved my life once when I was drowning in a river near our hometown. He's always been protective of me, but I've never seen him act like this before. He growled menacingly at whatever creature just tried attacking us until it ran away, screaming loudly enough for us both hear, despite how far away it already was getting fast. My dog then turned towards looking directly at myself with eyes full of concern, asking, "Are you okay?" repeatedly, until finally realizing that yes, I'm fine. Now let's go inside. We walked back together hand in hand towards house, talking about what just happened while trying not think too much about who or what might have done this. But once we reached home, neither one of us could find anything unusual besides small footprints leading up hillside through woods, which eventually disappeared altogether once they reached tree line, where no more prints could be seen anymore due to thick foliage covering entire area, preventing further tracking possible. We decided not to tell anyone else about this incident yet. Instead, we kept quiet, hoping maybe whatever did attack would never come back ever again. But unfortunately, things only got worse afterwards. Every night thereafter, starting exactly 12 hours later each day, exactly midnight, strange noises began coming from the surrounding forest below the mountain ridge upon which our house sat atop. Loud screams, growls, and howls echoed throughout the valley below, accompanied by heavy footsteps moving closer and closer each time these sounds occurred. It was as if something was stalking us, inching its way towards our home with each passing night. The sounds would eventually reach the edge of the closest part of the wooded area surrounding our property itself, about 50 yards distance, followed immediately afterward by loud crashing noises whenever something attempted breaking down our front door whenever these nightly visitations occurred. We were terrified, to say the least. We didn't know what was out there or why it was targeting us. We didn't know if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely. All we knew was that it was getting closer and closer each night, and that it seemed to be getting more and more aggressive. We tried to stay awake as long as we could each night, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but no matter how hard we tried, we could never see anything. The darkness outside our windows was so thick and impenetrable that it was impossible to see anything beyond the glass. We could only listen to the sounds and imagine what kind of creature could be making them. This went on for weeks, until one night I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't stand the fear and uncertainty any longer. I had to know what was out there. So I grabbed my flashlight and my dog, and we headed outside to investigate. We walked towards the edge of the closest part of the wooded area surrounding our property, where the sounds seemed to be coming from. As we got closer, the sounds got louder and more intense. We could hear heavy footsteps moving closer and closer, and then the loud crashing noises as something attempted to break down our front door. Suddenly, a large creature jumped out from behind a nearby tree. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It looked like some sort of deformed humanoid, with gray skin covered in scars. It had no eyes, only empty sockets where they should have been. Its mouth was filled with sharp teeth, which it bared at us as it opened its mouth wide. I shone my flashlight directly into its face, and it let out a deafening roar. My dog and I ran back to the house as fast as we could, with the creature hot on our heels. We managed to get inside and lock the door just in time. We haven't seen the creature since that night, but we still hear the sounds every night. We're not sure what to do. We're scared, and we feel trapped in our own home. We're considering moving, but we're not sure if we can afford it. We've tried contacting local authorities, but they don't seem to take us seriously. They think we're just making it up, or that we're hearing things. We've even tried setting up cameras outside our house to capture evidence of the creature, but so far, we haven't been able to catch anything on tape. We're at our wits' end. We don't know what to do or where to turn. We're living in constant fear, and it's taking a toll on our mental and physical health. We're losing sleep, we're constantly on edge, and we're starting to feel hopeless. I'm sharing this story here in the hopes that someone out there might have some advice for us, or might have experienced something similar. We're desperate for any kind of help or guidance. We just want to feel safe in our own home again. So, if you've read this far, thank you. And if you have any advice or suggestions, please, we're all ears. We just want this nightmare to end.